Can I ask you to kind of also talk about, because you and I had talked about what, you told me going to Paris, working there, kind of what, you formed like kind of a collective with other artists, you guys were kind of having shows, because you kind of really weren't getting shows from the galleries. I was just kind of wondering, going from New Orleans, going from that kind of history, and then going to Paris, and kind of living there, and kind of having a historical connection to that city, but then going there, what that kind of transition was like, or what that was like, just kind of living there and experiencing that.
Well, when I went there, it happened so quickly, I hadn't even thought about France. I really hadn't. I mean, it was in the culture that I grew up in, so of course it was always in the background, but I didn't consciously think about it. Mm-hmm. And it all happened very quickly. I was in school in New Orleans. Next thing I knew, in a week I was in school in France. I didn't speak French. How did that come about? Let's see. A teacher that I had by the name of Calvin Harlan, he was the main teacher at the art school in New Orleans at the university. He had a good friend who was a superintendent at the École des Beaux-Arts, and they had started a program. They wanted to start a program of exchanging between certain art schools in New Orleans, certain art schools in Paris. And Howard, who Phoenix knows, he and I were the first ones to do this. It was a guinea pig thing. And it happened like that. Because school in France starts like a month or a month and a half later than it does here. So we were already in school, already in art class. And then they turned around and said, "You've been accepted, get on the airplane and go." So we did. And then from there, at that time, so I didn't know anything about it. I didn't have any romantic idea about it at all. I'd heard things about, black artists being there at one time from the States. I didn't expect to see any of them, and I hardly saw any of them. The cafe scene I heard about, through Hemingway and things like that. But again, by the time I got there, it was very different. The cafes were not the same. That was like in the early 80s, the first time.
Okay, you're 80s.
And there were, there were TVs in the cafes. That changed things quite a bit. You couldn't just sit there and have, a cup of coffee after cup of coffee. But it was still great and really good work, and you could see good work in person rather than seeing it in books. So that was excellent. And at that time, the movement that was strong in the art schools was a movement called the Support Service Movement from a group of mostly painters who had started that movement, which was a Marxist movement that dealt with questioning how a painting is made. I didn't know that this would affect me so much, actually, when I went there. But my very teacher was one of the founders of the thing. So obviously I learned French and the critiques and all that stuff, just talking and then taking the piece apart. So they didn't believe that you should simply take canvas. I had no idea that this was going to affect me, but they said it's impossible to just take canvas, put it on a stretcher, put it together, put gesso or whatever ground you might have known to stop the paint from going right into the canvas, onto it, complete a painting, and then sign this. No. You have to think about every step in this and where this is. What this means as far as production, where it comes from, and politically where it is. And evidently it played a role in my art.
So I'm just going to take a quick pause. This is one of the other artists in the show. Her name is Elizabeth. This is our audience here. She is another figurative painter, and she's also in the second room for those of you who have looked at the work. So we've kind of just been talking about the exhibition and the work and history, and I'll bring you in a second. Okay. I'll give you a chance to kind of, relax on that. Sorry, I got thrown away. So if you want to,
well, originally I'm from Philadelphia, but I currently live in Atlanta. And part of what Kim was saying, I actually have a background in anthropology. Actually, I'm a medical anthropologist. And that sounds really fancy. It doesn't mean as much as it sounds, which is probably why this piece is really fascinating to me. But basically, in that profession, my research area, as opposed to being some far exotic place, was actually Mississippi and Louisiana. And so I studied or when people are willing to pay for my research, I research on how African Americans seek help for their health, if that makes sense. So, but honestly, no one wants to pay for that. So I ended up journeying into other areas, and since you're in Mississippi and Louisiana, then those areas become about the history of the place and so forth, and it becomes about, and for what people want to pay for, it becomes about civil rights. So I make a lot of money doing research for museums on civil rights in Mississippi and Louisiana. I make a lot of money, but I make my living doing that when people are not paying or buying my art. So that's my other life. But as an artist, which I'm always struggling to do and become, I started out as a photographer years ago and moved from photography into mixed media, semi sculpture, and more recently in the last 2.5 years have started doing far more metal casting, and in particular cast iron work. And so I'm really fascinated by the cast iron work because it allows me to have all of those threads from the anthropological perspective, the historical perspective, and looking at that. And I've been fascinated through my readings about iron plantations, which I confess I'd never heard of before in my life. But lo and behold, we did not just do cotton. So there were, I really who knew? So there were throughout the entire United States. There were iron plantations here in the north of Pennsylvania, all these places. If you see a place called Irontown, it's because there was an iron plantation there. But it wasn't always worked by African Americans or by Africans. It was also worked by immigrating Europeans and so forth. But in the South, the iron plantations were worked by African Americans. And so that has been very fascinating to me to look at that and to look at the use of the African lost wax technique as a medium for, or as a method for making my sculptures. And that, so that combination, that particular process, and I'm sort of process oriented, I love a really good process, and maybe that's why it didn't really bother me, Kim, but it did bother me because I was like, what am I doing? So it was a serious process to the minute I put that box in the mail to you. So
we Phoenix and I went back and forth quite a bit because part of the work actually had to be built here. So that was an interesting process because when we thought and I think this actually just kind of goes back to how, you know, as a curator and with an artist, you kind of have to be able to have flexibility because what you think, you know, the artist thinks what you're going to do, it's like, oh, well, that'd be a good idea, but that's going to make the ceiling cave in. I didn't necessarily know that before when we were thinking about the work. So you're like, that probably isn't going to work.
Right.
So how do we kind of refigure, you know, that? So it's like her, me, and the installer, and he's like mathematically figuring out, okay, let's build like a shelf, and I think I think the work still looks beautiful, but it's interesting because you guys wouldn't necessarily, as the audience, know that that's not the original way the piece was going to float. It was going to literally hang. But we didn't want things falling on your head, so
yeah, safety is a good thing. So that's just it allows me by doing the cast metal work, it allows me to feel intelligent basically, because it is a process. You have to think it through on so many levels of how to achieve that egg. You would not believe what I had to go through to get to this little egg. So you have to really think it through, you have to really problem solve, and so the whole process allows me to keep feeling like, oh, I have a brain, and it keeps me alert and alive, and it also keeps me connected to a very historical methodology that I know is rooted within my ancestral tradition and so forth and so forth and so forth, and so it makes me happy to do it that way. Even though it's very time consuming, it's very tedious, it's very heavy, it's a lot of work. I would love to have an assistant and any volunteers. But yeah. And then I try to mix it with other soft things like cloth and what have you for the juxtaposition of it because, you know, my reality isn't really like hard steel.